Welcome back to Daily Dose of Hebrew Weekend Edition. Today we're covering 1 Samuel 3:8, and we'll start today by looking at the syntax, morphology, and translation, and then move to a discussion of the accents probably next week on this one. So let's begin by reading the Hebrew together here. Vayosef Adonai kero Shemuel bashelishit. Vayakom vayelech el Eli. Vayomer Hinani ki karata li. Vayaven Eli ki Adonai kore lanaar. Now, for an initial translation, we're going to get, and the Lord added a calling of Samuel as the third. Or we can smooth this out a little bit to say a third time. And he arose, and he went to Eli, and he said, Here am I, or Here I am, for you called to me. Then Eli understood that the Lord was calling to the lad. So let's now take a look at the syntax and the details of this translation. And first, we open with a vav consecutive of yasaf, yod samic pei. And this is a Hifil imperfect 3ms with Adonai here as the subject. And the Lord added. Next, we get the direct object, or what the Lord added, namely a calling of Samuel. Now, kero here is an infinitive construct, what we would call a verbal noun, and it's functioning as the direct object. Samuel stands in the place of a genitive here, and so we get a calling of Samuel. The genitive here of Samuel would be something akin to a Greek objective genitive. I hesitate to even refer to that in a daily dose of Hebrew, but what we would think of as a Greek objective genitive. And what we mean by that is that Samuel was the one who was called. He's not the one who was doing the calling. So the calling didn't belong to him. He was the one being called. So we get the smoothed out English rendition then of, and the Lord called Samuel. So even though the Hebrew is literally, and the Lord added a calling of Samuel, we still get the English, and the Lord called Samuel. The final word in the initial clause here, up to the Segolta accent, is the quantitative notion. In other words, it's how many times the Lord has called to Samuel up to this point. So here we get the root for the numeral 3, and with the bait preposition, we get as the third, or in relation to the third, and hence we get the third time. So the whole clause then is, and the Lord added a calling of Samuel a third time, or to smooth it over again, and the Lord called Samuel a third time. Now, the next clause returns to the narrative to give us Samuel's movement as before. We've seen this before. The verbals here are call imperfect 3ms verbs plus vav consecutives. The first root here is kum, kof, vav, mem, and the second root is halach, he, lamed, kaf. Now, the location that Samuel rose and went to was to Eli, as indicated by the prepositional phrase here. Next, we get Samuel's direct speech introduced by the call imperfect 3ms of Amar, followed by our familiar Hinani, behold me, or here I am. Now, this verse is very similar to others we've done in the past few weeks, so I'm going to speed along here. Next, we get the ground clause for why Samuel arose and went to Eli. He thought that Eli called to him. Samuel said, Here I am, for you called to me. Karata here is the call perfect 2ms of the root kara. Remember that the lamed can be the marker of the direct object with kara, or it can work just fine to say, for you called to me. Either one of those would work, and I think get the point across. The final clause here begins with the vav consecutive on the call imperfect 3ms of bana, bait, nun, hey, meaning to understand or to perceive. The vav is likely temporal succession, and then Eli perceived. What did he perceive or understand? Eli understood that, with key here, he understood that the Lord was a caller to the young boy. Now, I know that that translation sounded kind of odd, but what I wanted to highlight was the nominal nature of the Hebrew participle, or maybe what we would call the substantive nature of the Hebrew participle. Kore here is a call active participle, masculine, singular, absolute. And participles are verbal adjectives, so they describe. Now, Hebrew tends to think of an adjective oftentimes as a descriptive noun in apposition. So, something like a red flower may be understood semantically as a flower, a red one, and hence the attributive adjective often follows its noun. Here, we would have the Lord as the subject, and then the participle would carry a descriptive noun nuance, hence the Lord, and we would supply the to be verb, the Lord was a caller. So now, even though I make a big deal about this, I'm doing so just to give you a more Semitic way to think about the translation. If we smooth this out into good, understandable ESV English, then we get Eli understood that the Lord was calling to the young boy. That's entirely appropriate. So in English, we tend to highlight the durative verbal nature of participles, giving them that ing form. And so that's appropriate here as well. The last thing I want to point out today before we wrap up is how we get the definite translation, the young boy. And we have the lamed preposition on na'ar here, and that seems obvious. However, the normal vowel pointing for the inseparable prepositions is a vocal schwa, and that's not what we have here. Notice here that the vowel pointing on this preposition looks awfully similar to the definite article. And indeed, that's what's going on here. Remember that when we put the inseparable prepositions, something like a bait, lamed, or kaf, when we put those on a definite word, the preposition simply supplants the hey of the article, and it keeps the vowel pointing the same as the article. So here we get the young boy, a definite noun. And of course, the context would support the young boy as well, since Samuel is the only young lad in the story so far. But since we're talking Hebrew morphology, we might as well point out that the lamed has supplanted the definite article, but retained its vowel pointing to point out that the definite article is still there. So we get the Lord called or was calling to the young boy. So that's going to wrap it up for today. Next week, we'll begin with the accents and walk through those accent marks of 1 Samuel 3:8. And until next time, shalom.